Henry Rice stood behind the counter of his diner, one hand resting on the light switch, the other gripping the edge of the old Formica countertop so hard his knuckles had gone white. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled like a wounded animal, hurling snow against the windows in angry fists. Inside, the diner was silent except for the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the occasional tick of the cooling grill. This was it. The last night. He'd been telling himself all day that he was ready, that he'd made peace with it. But now, standing here in the empty space that had been his whole world for 23 years, Henry found he couldn't quite bring himself to flip that switch. Because once those lights went out, once he locked that door behind him, it was over. Everything he and Martha had built together would just become another ghost story on Highway 287. Another failed dream that couldn't survive the modern world. The diner looked tired. Henry could see it now with the cruel clarity that comes when you know you're saying goodbye. The red vinyl on the booth seats was cracked and patched with duct tape. The black and white checkered floor tiles were faded to gray in the high-traffic areas. The neon sign outside, the one that used to glow bright red and say, "The Crossroads Diner, good food, good folks," now flickered weakly, the second O in good, having given up the ghost 2 years ago. But God, there were still traces of beauty here. Traces of what it had been. Martha had chosen those curtains. Yellow gingham, cheerful as sunshine. She'd painted that mural on the back wall herself, a sprawling scene of the Wind River Range at sunset. She'd spent 3 weeks on her hands and knees helping him lay this very floor, both of them young and broke and so full of hope it seemed impossible that hope could ever run out. "We'll build something that lasts," she told him on opening day, flour in her hair for making pies before dawn, her smile bright enough to light up the whole county. "A place where people feel at home. Where travelers can rest. Where the coffee's always hot and nobody's ever a stranger for long." And for a while, for a beautiful golden while, they had. Henry walked slowly along the counter, his fingertips trailing across its surface. He passed the old cash register that still dinged when you opened it. The coffee maker that had brewed 10,000 pots. The spinning stool where old Jim Patterson used to sit every morning for 16 years. Until the morning he didn't anymore. This place had been full of life once. Full of laughter and music from the jukebox and the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits. Truckers would stop in at all hours, and locals would gather for Sunday breakfast. High school kids would crowd into the booths after football games. Martha would float between the tables like a dance, knowing everyone's order by heart, knowing their stories, their heartaches, their small joys. But then the highway expansion came. The new bypass that routed traffic 30 miles east, leaving Highway 287 to the tumbleweed and the ghosts. Business slowed to a trickle. Then Martha got sick, that awful, crushing diagnosis that came out of nowhere and stole her away piece by piece over 18 months. The medical bills piled up like snow in a blizzard, and Henry burned through their savings, then their credit, then everything they had. She died on a Tuesday in April. 6 months ago now, though sometimes it felt like yesterday and sometimes it felt like a lifetime. After she was gone, Henry tried to keep going. He kept the diner open, even though most days he served maybe 5 customers. Grace Torres, his waitress of 12 years, stayed on even though he could barely pay her. She'd loved Martha too, and she understood that the diner was all Henry had left of his wife. Some days, Grace was the only reason he bothered to unlock the door at all. But you can't run a business on love and memories. The bank had been patient, more patient than they needed to be, honestly, but 3 weeks ago, the final notice came. Foreclosure. He had 30 days to pay $23,000 or lose everything. Henry had spent those 30 days trying to find a miracle. He'd applied for loans that no one would give him. He'd called his brother in Cheyenne, who had his own troubles and 3 kids in college. He'd even considered selling Martha's grandmother's ring, the only thing of value he had left, but he couldn't do it. That felt like betraying her all over again. So here he was. December 4th, the 30th day, the last day. Tomorrow morning, the bank would come. Tomorrow, this chapter would close forever. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from being opened and read too many times. It was a letter Martha had written to him during her last week, when she'd known she was dying but he'd still been pretending otherwise. My darling Henry, I know you're going to want to give up when I'm gone. I know you're going to think nothing matters anymore. But I need you to promise me something. Keep the lights on. Keep that diner running. Not for me, and not even for you, but for all those travelers out there who need a warm place to rest. You and I, we built something good. We built a home on a highway. Don't let it die just because I did. Love you forever. Martha. He'd broken that promise. Or rather, the world had broken it for him. He tried, God knows he tried, but trying wasn't enough when the money ran out and the highway was empty and the whole thing was just too heavy to carry alone. I'm sorry, Martha, he whispered to the empty diner. I'm so sorry. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket. Then he reached for the light switch again. That's when he heard it. A knock. Urgent, desperate, pounding against the front door. Henry's heart lurched. He looked up and saw a figure through the glass, a young man, hunched against the wind, snow covering his jacket and cap. Behind him, barely visible through the blizzard, was the hulking shape of an 18-wheeler. For a moment, Henry considered pretending he hadn't heard. He'd already cleaned the grill, already tallied out the register. $47, the saddest final total he could imagine. He'd said his goodbyes. He was done. But the knocking came again, more frantic now, and Henry saw the young man's face pressed against the glass. He couldn't have been more than 25. His lips were blue. And just like that, Henry felt something he thought had died with Martha stir back to life. The instinct to help. The inability to turn away from someone in need. Damn it, he muttered, but he was already moving toward the door, already turning the deadbolt, already pulling it open against the force of the wind. The young man practically fell inside, bringing a gust of snow and freezing air with him. He was shaking so hard his teeth chattered. Jesus, son, Henry said, pushing the door closed behind him. You okay? Thank you, the young man stammered. My truck. Engine died, about a mile back. I've been walking, thought I saw your light. Henry looked at him, really looked at him. He was wearing a denim jacket that was nowhere near warm enough for a Wyoming blizzard. His hands were red and raw, but his eyes were what got Henry, young, scared, far from home. Come on, Henry heard himself say. Sit down before you fall down. He guided the young man to the nearest booth, then went behind the counter and started the coffee maker. His hands moved on autopilot, doing what they'd done thousands of times before. When the coffee was ready, he poured a cup and brought it over. Drink this. Slow. The young man wrapped both hands around the mug like it was a lifeline. I'm Ben, he said. Ben Crawford. I can't thank you enough. I thought I was gonna die out there. You might have, Henry said honestly. This storm's a bad one. They're saying it's the worst December blizzard in 20 years. I heard that on the radio right before my engine gave out. Ben took a shaky sip of coffee. I'm heading to Casper. First long haul on my own. Got a delivery deadline and I thought I could beat the storm. Stupid. Not stupid. Just young. Henry found himself almost smiling. Though those two things overlap sometimes. Ben managed a weak laugh. Then his eyes widened. Oh man, were you closed? I saw the light still on and I just assumed. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Don't worry about it, Henry interrupted. And then, surprising himself, he asked, You hungry? I don't want to impose. Son, you walked a mile through a blizzard to get here. The least I can do is feed you. Besides. He glanced around the empty diner. I've got time. What Henry didn't say was, I've got nothing but time now. One last meal won't matter. He went back to the kitchen and fired up the grill. It felt good to hear it hiss back to life. He grabbed eggs from the refrigerator, bacon, bread for toast. His hands fell into the old rhythm, cracking eggs one-handed, laying bacon in perfect strips, buttering bread for the griddle. This was what he knew. This was what he was good at. And for just a little while longer, he could be the man Martha had believed in, the man who kept the lights on and made sure nobody went hungry. As Henry cooked, Ben slowly warmed up and started to talk. He was from a small town in Nebraska. His dad had been a trucker, had died in an accident when Ben was 12. Ben had always wanted to follow in his footsteps, to understand what his father had loved about the road. This was his third week with his CDL, his first solo run. Dad used to talk about places like this, Ben said, looking around the diner with something like reverence. Highway diners where the food was real and the people were kind. He said those places were like lighthouses. Said you could drive through a lot of darkness, but those lights would always bring you home. Henry's throat tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded and focused on the eggs. He was plating up Ben's food, eggs over easy, bacon crispy, wheat toast golden brown, when he heard it again. Another knock at the door. Then another. Henry looked up and felt his breath catch. Through the window, he could see 3 more figures, 3 more trucks pulled into the lot. The blizzard had apparently turned his nearly empty parking lot into a refuge. "Looks like you're not the only one who saw the light," Ben said quietly. Henry stood frozen for a moment, plate in hand. He had maybe $30 worth of food supplies left. He was supposed to be closing. This was supposed to be over. But when he looked at those faces pressed against the glass, when he saw the desperation and the cold and the need, he knew he couldn't turn them away. Martha wouldn't have. The diner, in its best days, never would have. "Guess we're having a party," Henry muttered. He set Ben's plate down in front of him, then walked to the door and opened it wide. "Come on in," he called out to the storm. "Coffee's hot and there's food. Get in here before you freeze." They came in like a flood, truck drivers of all ages, all grateful, all stamping snow off their boots and breathing visible sighs of relief. A woman with kind eyes. 2 men who looked like brothers. An older driver with a gray beard and a laugh that filled the room. And then, miraculously, Grace appeared. She burst through the door in her heavy coat, snow dusting her black hair, her dark eyes flashing. "Henry Rice, I saw all these trucks and I thought..." She stopped, taking in the scene. "What's going on?" "Storm's bad," Henry said simply. They needed a place to wait it out. Grace looked at him for a long moment, and he saw understanding bloom in her face. She knew this was supposed to be the last night. She knew he had almost nothing left to give. But she also knew neither of them could turn these people away. "Well then," she said, stripping off her coat and tying on an apron from muscle memory, "we better get cooking." And just like that, the diner came alive again. Henry and Grace worked side by side, stretching their meager supplies as far as they could go. They made eggs and bacon, pancakes from a mix, toast, coffee by the gallon. The drivers settled into the booths, and slowly the cold left their faces. Conversations started up. Someone found quarters for the jukebox, and Patsy Cline's voice filled the air. It felt like the old days. It felt like when Martha was alive and the highway was busy and the diner was the beating heart of this lonely stretch of road. Henry moved through it all in a kind of daze, part of him waiting to wake up, part of him never wanting this moment to end. Around midnight, as Henry was refilling coffee cups, he noticed one of the drivers, a weathered man in his 50s, standing near the counter, reading something. Henry's stomach dropped when he realized what it was. The foreclosure notice. He'd forgotten to take it down. It was still tacked to the wall behind the register. The driver turned to him, eyes serious. "This true? You're losing this place." Henry felt heat rise to his face. That's not your concern." But it was too late. The other drivers had heard. The diner went quiet except for Patsy Cline singing about falling to pieces. "How much?" another driver asked. "Don't," Henry started. "How much?" the man insisted, gentle but firm. Henry swallowed hard. 23,000. "But listen, I don't want." "And tomorrow's the deadline?" Henry nodded, feeling about 2 inches tall. Here he was, supposed to be helping these folks, and instead they were seeing his shame, his failure, all laid bare. "Everybody out there is driving because of places like this," the older driver said quietly. My dad used to stop here back in the 80s. He told me if I was ever on this route, to make sure I stopped at the crossroads. Said it was run by good people. That was a long time ago, Henry said, his voice rough. Things change. Some things shouldn't, Grace said from behind him. He turned and saw tears in her eyes. Some things are worth fighting for. The woman driver stood up from her booth. How much food you got left? Not much, Henry admitted. Couple dozen eggs, some bacon, pancake mix. I was supposed to close tonight anyway. This is just kindness, she finished for him. Just exactly what drivers like us need. They looked at each other, Henry and Grace and these strangers who had stumbled in from the storm. And in that moment, something passed between them, something Henry couldn't quite name but could definitely feel. It felt like hope, fragile and unexpected. It felt like maybe the story wasn't quite finished yet. Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying the highway in snow. But inside the Crossroads Diner, the lights burned warm and bright, and for the first time in 6 months, Henry Rice remembered what it felt like to not be alone. Henry woke with a start, his neck stiff from sleeping sitting up in one of the corner booths. For a moment, he was disoriented. The diner was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the occasional snore, bodies curled up in booths and stretched out on the floor with coats as blankets. Then it all came rushing back. The storm, the stranded drivers, the long night of coffee and conversation that had stretched until everyone finally surrendered to exhaustion somewhere around 3 in the morning. Pale morning light filtered through the windows, and Henry could see that the snow had finally stopped. The world outside looked transformed, buried under at least 2 feet of fresh powder, the highway invisible, the truck shapes in the parking lot looking like sleeping giants under white blankets. Henry rubbed his face and checked his watch. 6:30. On any normal day, he'd already have the coffee going and the grill heating up. But this wasn't a normal day. This was the day the bank came. This was the day he lost everything. He stood slowly, his back protesting, and made his way carefully between the sleeping bodies toward the counter. Grace was already there, somehow. He hadn't even heard her get up. She'd started the coffee and was standing at the register, staring at something on the counter. Grace, Henry said softly, not wanting to wake the others. She turned to him, and he was startled to see tears streaming down her face. She wasn't making a sound, just crying silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. Grace, what's wrong? He moved quickly to her side. She couldn't speak. She just pointed at the counter. There, next to the old cash register, was an envelope. A plain white envelope with Henry written on the front in careful block letters. It was thick, bulging with something. Henry picked it up with shaking hands. It wasn't sealed. He opened it and looked inside. Money. Bills of all denominations, 20s, 50s, hundreds, folded and stacked and filling the envelope completely. His brain couldn't process it at first. He pulled them out, spreading them on the counter, and started counting with fingers that didn't quite seem to belong to him. 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000. Henry. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. There's more. She pointed to the counter, and Henry saw what he'd missed in his shock. There were other envelopes. 5 of them, stacked neatly. Each one with Henry written on the front. Each one full. He opened them one by one, counting with Grace, both of them crying now, neither of them caring. The total kept climbing. 15,000, 18,000, 20,000, $23,547. The exact amount of the foreclosure, plus a little extra. Henry had to sit down. His legs just gave out, and he found himself on the floor behind the counter, his back against the cabinet, staring at the money spread out above him like it was a hallucination. They did this, Grace said, sliding down to sit beside him. While we were sleeping. They did this. But how? Why? Henry couldn't make sense of it. These are strangers. They don't even know me. Yes, they do, Grace said firmly. They've been knowing you all night. Every cup of coffee you poured. Every time you asked if they needed anything. Every story you told about Martha and this place. They know exactly who you are, Henry Rice. The sound of movement made them both look up. The drivers were starting to wake, sitting up in the booths, stretching and yawning. Ben, the young trucker who'd knocked first, was one of the first on his feet. When he saw Henry and Grace on the floor, saw the money on the counter, his face broke into a tired but radiant smile. "You found it," he said simply. Henry tried to speak but couldn't. His throat had closed up completely. The older driver with the gray beard sat up, rubbing his eyes. "We took up a collection," he said matter-of-factly, as if they'd done nothing more remarkable than chip in for pizza. "Made some phone calls, too. Called our dispatchers, our companies, some other drivers we know on the road. Word traveled fast. Everybody wanted to help. But, this is too much," Henry finally managed. "This is your money. Your livelihoods. I can't." "You fed us," the woman driver interrupted, standing and walking over. Her name was Rita. Henry remembered now. She told him last night about her 3 grandkids waiting for her in Montana. "You opened your doors when you had every reason to close them. You gave us shelter in a storm. You think we don't know what that's worth." The notice said tomorrow, another driver added, Luis, who'd been on the road for 22 years. "We figured that meant you needed help today." Henry looked around at all of them, these people who 12 hours ago had been complete strangers. They were watching him with expressions ranging from gentle to fierce, but all of them determined. All of them absolutely certain they'd done the right thing. "I don't." Henry's voice cracked. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Rita told him. "Just keep this place running. Keep doing what you did last night. The world needs more of that, not less." Ben crouched down next to Henry. "My dad used to say that truckers look out for their own. And Henry, after last night, you're one of us. This diner, it's part of the family now." The family. The word hit Henry right in the center of his chest. He thought of Martha's letter in his pocket, her words about keeping the lights on. He thought about how he'd been ready to give up, to let it all go dark. And he thought about how these strangers, these beautiful, impossible strangers, had refused to let that happen. "Thank you," he whispered. Then louder, looking at each of them in turn. "Thank you. I promise you. I promise I'll make this count. I'll keep the doors open. His voice broke, but he pushed through. "I'll make you proud." "You already have," Grace said beside him, squeezing his hand. The next hours were a blur of activity. Once the emotional storm had passed, practical matters took over. The highway department came through with plows, clearing the road. The drivers, anxious about their delayed deliveries, started preparing to leave. But before they did, something remarkable happened. Ben made a phone call to his trucking company. Then Luis made one. Then Rita. One by one, they talked to their dispatchers, their bosses, their fleet managers. And one by one, they told the same story. About a diner on Highway 287, about a man named Henry Rice, about a place that represented everything good about the road. By noon, Henry had received 3 phone calls from trucking companies asking if he'd be interested in providing regular meal stops for their drivers. By 2 o'clock, a regional food distributor had called, offering him wholesale rates on supplies if he'd agree to stay in business. By evening, the local newspaper had gotten wind of the story and sent a reporter out. "I don't understand," Henry kept saying to Grace as the phone rang yet again. "How is this happening?" "Word of mouth, honey," Grace said, grinning wider than he'd seen her smile in months. "The CB radios are on fire. Truckers are posting about you on their Facebook groups. You're famous." "I don't want to be famous," Henry protested. "I just want to keep the diner open." "Well, looks like you're going to do both." That evening, after the last of the stranded drivers had departed with promises to return, after Henry had gone to the bank and paid off the entire foreclosure amount in cash, the teller's eyes nearly popping out of her head, after the reporter had left and the sun had set on what should have been the last day of the Crossroads Diner, Henry and Grace sat together in a booth, exhausted and exhilarated. "Martha would have loved this," Grace said softly. Henry felt tears prick his eyes again. He'd cried more in the past 24 hours than he had in the 6 months since Martha died. She would have, he agreed. She always believed in people. Even when I didn't. Especially when I didn't. So what now? Grace asked. We've got a second chance here, Henry. What are we going to do with it? Henry looked around the diner, his diner, saved from the brink, given new life by the kindness of strangers. We're going to fix this place up, he said slowly, the ideas forming as he spoke. We're going to make it better. Not fancy. It doesn't need to be fancy. But clean. Welcoming. The kind of place Martha always envisioned. That'll take money, Grace pointed out. We've got a little extra, Henry said, thinking of the $547 beyond the foreclosure amount. And I bet we can find more. Maybe a small business loan now that we've got contracts coming in. Maybe I can finally fix that sign out front. Get the O in good working again. Grace laughed. Now you're thinking. Over the next weeks and months, that's exactly what they did. Henry worked harder than he had in years, but this time it felt different. This time, he wasn't working alone in grief and desperation. He was working with purpose, with hope, with a community that had rallied around him. The truckers kept their promises. The ones who'd been there that snowy night came back, and they brought others. Word continued to spread through the trucking community like wildfire. The Crossroads Diner was back in business, and it was a place worth stopping for. Henry used the extra money, plus a small loan from a bank that was suddenly very interested in his success story, to make improvements. He patched the vinyl on the booth seats. Grace helped him choose a retro red that made the whole place look brighter. They repainted the walls. They fixed the jukebox so it played without eating quarters. They bought new dishes to replace the chipped ones. And yes, they fixed the sign. The day the repairman got that second O in good glowing again, Henry stood outside in the parking lot for 10 minutes, just looking up at it. The Crossroads Diner. Good food, good folks, it proclaimed in bright red neon. Perfect and whole. The local community started coming back too. Families who'd given up on the diner years ago when it started to decline. Ranchers and their workers stopping in for breakfast. High school kids discovering it like it was a new secret, not realizing their parents and grandparents had been coming here for decades. Grace hired 2 part-time waitresses, locals who needed the work. Henry brought on a prep cook to help with the morning rush. The Crossroads wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving in a way it hadn't since before Martha got sick. But the most important change was the wall. Henry's idea, but Grace who helped him execute it. They cleared off one wall near the entrance and started putting up photos. Pictures of the truckers who'd saved the diner that night. They tracked them all down and asked for photos, which arrived in the mail one by one. Ben grinning in front of his truck. Rita with her grandkids. Luis with his wife of 30 years. The gray-bearded driver whose name turned out to be William, looking dignified and kind. But they didn't stop there. They kept adding photos. Every trucker who stopped by and became a regular, every family who made the Crossroads part of their routine, every person who walked through the door and became part of the story. Within months, the wall was covered. Hundreds of faces, hundreds of stories, all connected by this one place on a lonely stretch of highway. Henry put up a small plaque beneath the collection, "Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the strangers who become friends. Sometimes it's the friends who become family." Martha's photo had a place of honor in the center. Henry had chosen one from their opening day, her in her yellow gingham apron, laughing at something he'd said, the diner bright and new behind her. Some days, he could still hear her laugh. Some days, he swore he could feel her hand on his shoulder as he worked the grill. "You did it, Martha," he'd whisper to her photo when the diner was quiet. "We kept the lights on." 6 months after the night that changed everything, on another snowy evening, though not nearly as severe as that fateful blizzard, Henry stood behind the counter during the dinner rush. The diner was packed. Every booth was full, the counter stools all occupied, the jukebox playing Hank Williams, and the smell of coffee and frying onions filling the air. Grace was working one section of tables, Sarah, one of the new hires, taking another. The prep cook, Manuel, was keeping up with orders in the back. Everything hummed with life and energy and purpose. Ben had stopped in earlier. He made it a point to come by every 2 weeks now, timing his routes to include the crossroads. He'd told Henry that other drivers were doing the same, going slightly out of their way to stop here, to be part of something that mattered. "You're like a mascot," Ben had joked. "The guy who proved that kindness counts." "I didn't prove anything," Henry had protested. "You all did. That night, what you did, that proved it." "No, Henry," Ben had said seriously. "What you did proved it. Opening that door when you had every reason not to. That's where it started. We just followed your lead." Now, as Henry poured coffee for a rancher he'd known for 20 years and waved hello to a family with 3 kids piling into a booth, he felt something he hadn't felt since before Martha died. He felt whole. Not the same. He'd never be the same without Martha. The grief was still there, would always be there in some form. But it had changed from something crushing into something he could carry. A weight, yes, but also a reminder. A connection to someone he'd loved with his whole heart, someone who'd believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. The door opened, bringing in a gust of cold air and a young couple Henry had never seen before. They looked uncertain, tired from traveling. The woman was pregnant, very pregnant, and the man had his arm protectively around her shoulders. Henry caught Grace's eye and nodded. She was already moving toward them with menus and her warmest smile. But Henry walked over too, because that's what he did now. That's who he'd remembered how to be. "Welcome to the crossroads," he said, and meant it with everything in him. "Come on in. We've got hot coffee, good food, and all the time in the world. Make yourselves at home." The young man's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you," he said. "We've been driving for hours and everything else was closed or looked unwelcoming. But then we saw your sign." Henry glanced out the window at the neon glow, that beautiful red light cutting through the darkness and the falling snow. "That's what it's there for," Henry said. "To let people know they're not alone. That there's a place to rest. That somebody's keeping the lights on." As he seated the couple and brought them water and coffee, as he took their order and promised them the blue plate special would warm them right up, Henry felt Martha's presence so strongly it was almost physical. Not haunting, comforting. Like she was standing right beside him, smiling that smile that had made him fall in love with her 40 years ago. That presence seemed to say, "This is what I meant. This is keeping the lights on." Later that night, after the dinner rush had eased and most of the tables had cleared out, Henry stood at the window looking out at the highway. A truck rolled by, its lights cutting through the dark, the driver giving a friendly honk as he passed, recognizing the diner, acknowledging its presence. Grace came to stand beside him. "Good day," she said simply. "Good day," Henry agreed. "You know what I think?" Grace said after a moment. "I think Martha's proud of you. I think she's watching all this and just beaming." Henry nodded, his throat tight. "I hope so. I really hope so. I know so." Grace squeezed his arm. "This place, it's her legacy as much as yours. Maybe more. She taught you how to do this. How to open your heart even when it's broken. How to give even when you think you have nothing left. That night with the blizzard? You were living out everything she taught you. I was just—" "You were being exactly who you are," Grace interrupted firmly. "Who you've always been. You just forgot for a little while. Those truckers, they didn't save the diner, Henry. They reminded you that it was worth saving. That you were worth saving. There's a difference." Henry looked at her, this woman who'd stayed when she had every reason to leave, who'd believed in him and Martha's dream even in the darkest times. "Thank you, Grace. For everything. I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Well, that's what family does," she said with a gentle smile. "They show up. They stay. They keep each other going." Family. There was that word again. The word that had meant one thing before Martha died and meant something different now. Something bigger. Henry looked around his diner, at the photos on the wall, at the customers lingering over coffee, at the warm light spilling out onto the snow-covered parking lot. He thought about Ben and Rita and Luis and William and all the others who'd given so much to save a place they'd never seen before that night. He thought about the drivers who made it a point to stop by, the locals who'd come back, the strangers who'd become regulars. He thought about how close he'd come to turning off those lights forever. And he thought about how grateful he was, how impossibly, overwhelmingly grateful, that he'd heard that first knock at the door. That he'd made the choice to open it. That he'd remembered, even in his grief and despair, how to be kind to a stranger on a cold night. "You know what?" Henry said to Grace. "I think we should start staying open a little later. Especially on nights like this, when the weather's bad. Just in case someone needs a place to stop." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Henry Rice, you're already working 12-hour days." "I know. But I also know what it's like to need a light in the darkness. And I know what it's like to find one." He smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Besides, we've got a reputation to maintain now. Good food, good folks, remember? That's a promise." "That it is," Grace agreed. "All right then. Later hours it is. But I'm making you take Sundays off. Martha would want that." "Deal." As the last customers left that night, calling out their thanks and promises to return, Henry did his closing routine. But this time it felt different. This time, he wasn't saying goodbye. He was just saying goodnight, knowing tomorrow would come, knowing the doors would open again, knowing the coffee would brew and the grill would sizzle and the neon sign would glow its welcome into the darkness. He stood at the light switch, the same spot he'd stood 6 months ago, ready to give up, ready to let it all go. He put his hand on it, but this time there was no hesitation. This time, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was keeping a promise. To Martha. To the truckers who'd saved him. To everyone who'd walk through that door tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. He was keeping the lights on.